All right. Thank you guys for sticking around. What a movie, right? How many of you saw it for the first time tonight? All right. Yeah, such an incredible film. And we are incredibly lucky to have with us tonight a wonderful post-screening talk and Q&A with Dr. Gloria J. Wilson, Assistant Professor and Social Science Researcher in Arts Education at Middle Tennessee State University. We're so happy to have her here with us. I'd like to invite her up to the stage right now, and we'll get a brief talk, and then we'll open it up to you guys for a Q&A. Thanks so much for being here.
Hello. Yes. All right, so Zach asked the question that I had as I was sitting right there in the middle. And I sat there strategically, well, for two reasons, because he told me that the sound and the viewing would be best in that area. But also I thought that it would be really interesting to sit in the middle of a crowd as the movie was playing. So I'll admit the first time that I saw this movie was at home. And so I didn't get the viewing experience of viewing it within a crowd to kind of listen for the reactions, and I thought it was really interesting to listen to what people were saying, what was happening in the moments that I thought were funny, and other people looked like they were at the edge of their seats, so it was really interesting to kind of sit in the middle. So it's also interesting to know there are quite a few of you that have only seen it for just the first time tonight. So I'm really excited to be here and get to talk to you all about something that I don't often get to do in the classroom. So let me give you just a little bit of background about me before we launch into a discussion about the film. So I do teach art education courses at MTSU, and what that actually means is that I prepare students to go out and teach art in K-12 environments, in museum spaces, community spaces. And prior to coming to MTSU, I taught high school art for 9 years. And so when I found out there were a special group of students here, high school film students, that actually put me at ease, because for the last couple of weeks in thinking about what I was going to talk about, because there is a lot to talk about, just the idea that there are high school students in the audience makes me feel at home. So where are the high school students? Hey, you all. There's just a soft spot in my heart always for middle school and high school students. I also taught middle school for 4 years, and so glad to have you all in the audience. I expect that you all will have good questions at the end of it, okay? So let me turn my clicker on, and in the interest of time, I'm gonna kind of, let's see. No worries. All right, yay. All right, so I thought that it was really, really interesting to sort of capture Jordan Peele's response. And according to those who were reporting on the Oscars, he was the first person to tweet his win. And so this is what he tweeted. And so I thought it was interesting. When I read his tweet, there were so many things that went through my mind. As I told you all before, most of my all of my professional life, I have been looking at images. Even as a student in undergrad, I was trained to look at images, and more specifically, trained to look at the still image. But my interest has always been in social behaviors and how humans interact with each other. And so when I look at images, I look at much more than what is just surface level. And so it's really interesting to me to watch the moving image and to watch social interactions happen on the screen. And as I said before, I don't often get to do this in my class. I try to sneak it in there every now and then. I'll drop a Beyonce video or a Jay-Z video and have students unpack that. So this is so exciting for me to be able to do this with you all tonight. So what was interesting to me about the tweet is that I was looking at the question mark and the exclamation point and the question mark after I just won an Oscar. And so to me, that meant he was really, really shocked and surprised, but also excited at the same time. So I, as a person of color, could only imagine having to be in his shoes, a person who wrote a screenplay about a topic that is so difficult to talk about, right? And it's a topic that is often brushed under the rug. People have very different experiences in talking about race, in dealing with race. The many years that I've taught students, white students, black students, Hispanic students, I hear so many different stories. And so for me to look at this image of him and put it next to the tweet that he offered up, that meant quite a bit to me. So this quote came directly from his Oscar speech. Did you all watch the Oscars, any of you? Okay, very cool. And so this quote stood out to me as he was delivering his speech, because that also meant a lot to me. So stating that he stopped writing this movie 20 times because he thought it was impossible, right? And so that's kind of a loaded statement there. That made me think again about what could have been playing in his mind as a black person writing about race, and not only that, being an artist, offering up your very, very personal experience to the world for people to engage with and perhaps for people to also reject, right? And so this statement meant quite a bit to me. Not sure if you all know that this project began for him at the outset of the first term of Barack Obama's presidency. Were you all aware of that? So this piece has been a decade in the making. So in the world of research, we would call that a longitudinal study. So he has been thinking about this for quite some time. He's been observing, which is the thing that we do as scientists. He's been asking questions. He's been listening to conversations. He exists also as a black male in America, which has a very unique history associated with race. And so when I heard him say this quote, I thought this is going to be important to talk about and also to think about. So my world of research is mainly arts-based. And what that actually means is that I get to examine images, both still and moving, and I also get to look at how things are represented, how the images are represented. And so in the classes that I teach, and I have at least one student here. She was sitting right next to me. Who else is here? Is anyone else? Who is that? Is that Mary? No. Oh, Kiana. Okay, good. All right. So in my classes, I teach an aesthetics class. It's one of my favorite classes to teach. And in my classes, when I have students engage with the image, I have them look at 4 things, or I have them consider 4 things. And this was very helpful for me when I also look at the moving image. So the 4 things that I have my students consider are the artist, so the maker of the work. I have them consider the content of the work, right? I have them consider the audience, so who's viewing, and finally, and this is what I consider in the work that I do the most important, the context. The context under which the artist is making the work, so who is the artist? The context of the subject of the work, what is happening here? the audience, who is viewing this work, and what perspectives do they bring, and what could be the difference between the artist's intent and the viewer's perception of the work. And finally, the context, which is the most important. So all of these things need to be grounded in context. Everything has a history, and if we don't consider the history under which something was inspired to be produced, or even the history of the artist, then we're missing out. We're missing out on so much information, okay? And so 2 questions that I have my students respond to, and not only that, but me, when I look at the still and the moving image, I have to ask myself, what is happening here? What's happening here? And how has this been represented, okay? And I think this is important for you to think about as I quickly go through the next couple of slides, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So what was really special about what Jordan Peele did as a creative is that in writing this screenplay, what I believe he hoped to do was just to push the racial consciousness needle just a bit forward, okay? And so this was a huge risk. So considering that he is a Black writer and filmmaker, and he has created a story that has never been seen on the screen in the way that he wrote it. So creating the social thriller, right? Doing those 2 things at the same time was unique, and it's what won him the award, the original screenplay. And so when I thought about original, you know, I kind of laughed because I thought, this is not a new story. This is not a new story. So when I watched this film, and when I heard other people of color, Black people specifically, watch this film, and even the people who were laughing, I found that interesting because my guess is gonna be that it was the Black people in the room, okay? And so if we're gonna have a discussion about race tonight, we need to feel okay by putting identifiers and signifiers, Black and white, in the air. I tell my students that all the time. This is, you know, the place to do that, and the film is the catalyst to do that. And so what I imagine his hope was that he was writing the story that he wished that he could see, okay? And so what I do think is generative about this film is that it causes people to have the conversation, right? And I even heard him say that it wasn't his intent to create a divisiveness, but it was at his best hope that it would bring people together in conversation. So I imagine in the 20 times that he decided, you know, should I put this down? Should I continue to go? These were all the things that were weighing heavily in his consciousness. All right, so let's move forward into the film. So when trying to prepare for this talk, I went down many rabbit holes because this movie is loaded. And in fact, so loaded, there's a class either at Stanford or at UCLA that is structured around this film alone. And I tell my students all the time that when we have discussions about race, it could take a lifetime just to understand the nuances, the systems and the institutions that work in tandem in order to keep racism at its core in a fixed state in the way that it is. And that's why it makes it so difficult to talk about and so difficult to unpack, because you all don't get that in school. And I think that's unfortunate. I think it's unfortunate for everybody. And it's leading me into my next slide, which I believe is the overarching theme of this film in general, which is the sunken place. Okay? And so I can't tell you how many times I went over and over and over in my mind trying to decide what images to include in this notion of the sunken place. And so at first glance, if you are seeing this movie for the first time, The idea of the sunken place occurred probably for you in this lower left-hand image. This is the iconic image that is usually used when we think about this movie. And so I would like to challenge you to think about the fact that the sunken place for Chris, the protagonist in the movie, started very early, and even before this image here, right? So a black man existing in this space, have you considered that the sunken place is kind of the natural existence, okay? And so what I want to kind of toy with here is the idea of the mind and the body. And so I think it plays out beautifully in this film here. So it's first taking over your mind in order to get access to the body. Does that make sense? And so in this scene, in the center, at the very, very beginning of the film, I thought this was an important moment to capture, to consider this notion of the sunken place. Because Chris is sitting here, he's thinking about the deer, and of course you probably know by now the association with the deer is with his mother. You know, the idea that he was helpless, he could not save her, and so he had to go back and check on the deer. So while he's thinking about that weighty situation, he's also now having to navigate what to do in this situation when the cop is asking for his information. And so at this point, Rose, his girlfriend, the move that she makes is quite interesting, and Jordan Peele does it brilliantly. So he wants you to still find safety in the girlfriend. He wants you to believe that there's no way that she could know that her family is doing these horrible things. And so in this moment, she sort of intervenes and stands in between the cop and Chris and kind of shuts that situation down, right? And so the particulars of Chris's body posture are very restrained. And so any black male in this room, or any black female who is a sister of a black male, the mother of a black male, the cousin of a black male, probably felt something very visceral in that moment, right? And so you also understand that Chris is very limited in his movements. He can't get angry, right? And really, even in his calm state, that's still a place that's not comfortable because he's having to restrain himself. Right? So if we think about the history of policing and black males in this country, and we think about the time that Jordan Peele was writing this script, it was right around the time that Trayvon Martin was murdered, okay? And so he's drawing real references to what's happening. Again, that's research, folks, right? And so not only am I the researcher here, but Jordan Peele is also doing his due diligence to make this smart movie, okay? And so we've already talked about this image here, which, you know, is not a far reach when thinking about the sunken place. It's actually really obvious. And then the image in the far right corner as well. Further in the basement, he's sort of strapped down, and there's another degree of helplessness that's happening in that shot there. There's so many images that I could have included for this sunken place, and I'm wondering at this point if you all are now thinking about what those moments might be, okay? So the teacher in me wants to ask you questions, but I'm not gonna do that for the sake of time. But just consider all of the moments in the film where you get the feeling that Chris feels helpless. I mean, think about the interactions with he and Georgina, who was the housekeeper, the interaction with Logan, who was the guy from the beginning of the movie that was abducted, and then think about his interactions with Walter, right? So any black person in the room, if you have experience being at a party or in a classroom, even in a classroom where you are one of two black people, right? So you kind of scan the room and you look and you connect eyes and you're like, yes, right? And so you'll go over and try to make that connection only to find if the person is not necessarily, I don't know, for lack of a better word, woke, right? Then you get that sense of rejection just like Chris felt, sunken place, okay? And so again, in the interest of time, I'll move on. But Jordan Peele gave us his perspective on what the sunken place was. The sunken place means we're marginalized. No matter how hard we scream, the system silences us. And so in that, he wasn't only talking about Black people, but he was talking about women. He was talking about anyone in the entire sort of big project of oppression and marginalization. Any of those voices at any given point can feel silenced. So you think about the Me Too movement, that's not a mistake, you know? It's almost like a volcano that's been dormant for a while. And after a while, that volcano erupts. And these movements, Black Lives Matter, all of these things, even with the school shooting, right? So even students are now feeling like, hold up, do we matter, right? And so what happens when you feel silenced for long enough? You will erupt, okay? Hashtag angry Black person. And that's how those stereotypes come into being, because there is a kernel of truth in those stereotypes. All right. So remember how I told you I wanted to consider first the mind and then the body? So taking, for instance, the bingo game that we then learn is actually an auction, okay? And so there's no surprise that there's a history of auctioning off bodies of the African diaspora. There is literature that points to that, right? And so again, Peele has done his research. He's done his research. And so the literature is there. I always say that it's one thing to read about a phenomenon. It's another thing to hear about it. It's an entirely different thing to see it. And the still image doesn't move you enough. It's the moving image that enables us to become empathetic and to emote. It appeals to more of the senses, and that's the power in what Jordan Peele has done. I mean, this is the third time I've seen this, and each time it gets better. And I notice things I didn't notice before, and I'm thinking, this guy, I mean, in the moments that he sort of draws out the scene, you know, where the camera doesn't move, I mean, that's such an effective tool to build this suspense, right? And then he's got, who was the friend's name? Is it Rod? That's kind of the release valve, right? So he's building this tension, and then shoot to the friend. And then you're like, okay, there's some relief, because right now, as my student was saying, she was like, I'm gonna have to go take a pill or something. I don't know, Carrie Ann, what did you say? But I could just hear the moments of her tension, and then, you know, release when you shoot to the friend Rod. What I wanted to consider, or what I came to at the end of this movie, was this idea of appropriation, right? And so the very definition of appropriation is taking something that's not yours, often from another culture, and often without permission, okay? And so I thought to myself, holy moly, this is an example of the most extreme and violent appropriation of a body that I can think of. I mean, it was so clear to me. It was so clear to me. All right. Final slide, I think. Whew. So again, with the body, policing and the criminalization of the body. So it came to me in my second viewing how significant the police presence was at the beginning of the film and at the end of the film. And I don't think it was a mistake, and I'm not sure at what point in his process he decided for it to happen that way. Has anyone seen the alternate ending to this? Oh, my goodness. So this is spoiler alert. I'm going to tell you what the alternate ending is. If you don't want to hear it, I'm not sure what to tell you to do. So, as I told you before, what's important to remember is that he started this project at the very beginning of Obama's presidency, right? And so what we began to hear that was quite annoying is the idea that because now we have a black president, we are now post-racial, all of racism is solved, right? And so in the process of writing this, he wrote the alternate ending first because he was annoyed too. Annoyed at the myth that we were all of a sudden healed, we were post-racial, it didn't matter anymore, we had a win, we had a black president. And so the alternate ending was a police car showing up, and it didn't end this way. Chris ended up in jail because Jordan Peele wanted to make a point. He wanted to make a point to folks that, no, don't fall asleep. This is a real thing, and this is continuing to happen, right? And so as he was finishing the script, he did a screening of it, and this is the time where the Obamas were leaving, and then we got our current situation. He needed black people to have a win. He needed black people to have a win, and he changed the ending at the last moment, okay? So in the screening, he could tell with the alternate ending, which, I mean, this ending didn't even exist at first, okay? So imagine the alternate ending, and we're in our current situation, and you see a screening, and it just sort of reinforces this idea that it doesn't matter that black men are going to prison. It doesn't matter that they have not had a win, a consistent win, okay? And so that is what changed his mind. That's what changed his mind, and then we got the ending that we got. How many of you thought it would go down differently when you saw the police lights? Or you were hoping. And what is so interesting about the way that he crafted this film, and I listened to an interview that he gave, his intent was to be able to have all viewers empathize with the protagonist, right? The protagonist being a black male. And in most situations in horror films, the black person doesn't make it past 5 minutes. Those of you who are film folks, and full disclosure, I'm not a film person per se, not formally trained to look at films, but I know that that is true. And so what he wanted to do, and he so effectively do, and I agree with Allison that he got robbed of, Best Picture, because this is good. And every single time you watch it, you see something different, and you go, oh my gosh, this is really good. He is so smart. And so, there's this idea of capturing the nuances of racism even in white liberalism, right? So the setting is in the suburb, which is not necessarily different than some other horror films, to my understanding. His inspiration was from Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, which is a comedy. Also, Stepford Wives, those of you who have seen that. And also Rosemary's Baby. So this is the baby that was birthed out of all of those things together. And I think he did a brilliant job of creating a work that is creative, but that's rooted not only in autobiography. In the research world, that's called autoethnography, so systematic study of the self, ethnography, systematic study of cultures. For me, this is the embodiment of a arts-based project, and I just think it's brilliant. I think it's brilliant. And so I will stop there.
Yeah, it's getting late here, and I know some of the students will probably need to go, but I would like to open it up for maybe 2 questions, and then we can continue talking in the lobby if you'd like. So if you have a question real fast, raise your hand. If not, if you're more comfortable, we can all just go out into the lobby and have like a very, informal chat, because I know there's a lot to talk about with this.
Thank you all for your
Yeah.
time
Why don't
and
we just-
attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being here. And just a reminder, guys, these are happening every Tuesday this month. So if you liked what you saw here, come back, give the rest of the films a chance. And thanks again to
sure.
Dr. Gloria Wilson.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it, you all. Thank you.